Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Frank Vesta, and thanks for being with us. As state legislative sessions begin to wrap up around the country, Ballotpedia has tracked roughly 20 enacted bills related to ESG investing across 14 states thus far in 2024. What do these bills have in common, and why are we seeing so many more bills that oppose ESG investing than those that aim to promote it? Today, I'm joined by Jimmy McAllister, who leads our ESG coverage here at Ballotpedia. Jimmy, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. So to start, Jimmy, can you help us better understand ESG in the context of public policy and how it relates to public funds directly? How do states aim to influence this sort of investment within their borders?
Yeah, so the term environmental, social, and corporate governance, or ESG, refers to basically an investment or corporate governance approach that involves the consideration of factors in your investments and decisions that are kind of outside of your traditional purely financial factors, right? So it involves the extent to which your decisions conform to non-financial factors or standards. So like, for example, you might have a more classically or purely financial way of investing that looks at a lot of balance sheets to kind of see how much debt or how many assets a company has. You might look at income statements to, see how much money a company is actually making. Historical performance projections, those give you an idea of, how the company's growing over time, give you an idea of where the company might be going. And then, you might look at the current stock price and just kind of weigh all those things and determine whether a company seems like a good investment. So ESG doesn't necessarily throw out all of those, traditional classic financial considerations, but it kind of adds in these considerations related to, does this company hurt the environment? Does it engage on social issues, promoting transgender and abortion causes? There are all kinds of different things that you can consider in the context of an ESG investing framework. But those are some of the things that ESG investing basically says we should think about these things in addition to the financial factors. So then, in the context of public policy, like you were saying, you basically have this debate over whether public money should be going to, support these sorts of non-financial, social, environmental, ESG causes. Or, if on the other side of the coin, public money, especially for like retirees and pension funds, should be exclusively invested for, financial purposes, on the basis of like balance sheets, income statements, cash flow statements, and all those things we mentioned.
Yeah, and so whether they're in favor or against, most of the legislation we're seeking to change how their state approaches ESG investing, especially when it comes, like you mentioned, to public funds. And the investment strategy has been in the mainstream since the 90s, but it really began to surge in prominence near the end of the 2010s and into the early 2020s.
Yeah.
Over the last 2 or 3 years, though, Jenny, we've seen what many call a reckoning with the investment strategy. So how would you summarize the series of events that triggered legislators into reevaluating the sorts of laws that either promote or suppress ESG investing?
A lot of people don't kind of realize how far back it goes. It's a little hard to pinpoint a super specific event or even multiple events that definitely kicked it off. Yeah, I'm sure there are smarter people than me out there who have a better answer, but it's important to realize this idea has been around for a long time. Even back in the 70s, the economist Milton Friedman was basically pushing back against ESG investing strategies. He wrote an article that was titled "Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits." And it was really kind of this, it was kind of this direct argument against all the business people at the time who were saying a lot of the same things they're saying now, where, businesses should be concerned about the environment. They have a responsibility to kind of avoid pollution and fight against discrimination and engage on social causes and do all these things that the businesses saw as social goods. But Friedman basically argued that, that's it's a good way for businesses to get in bed with the government, and that these types of business goals that they were talking about would hurt the free market. But to take a stab at it more recently, I think you've really just seen a lot more high profile sorts of business activity that has just rubbed a lot of people as overtly political or partisan.
Okay.
So, off
Like what? Can you give some examples?
off the top of my head, a few years back, Major League Baseball boycotted Georgia and moved its All-Star game out of Atlanta over the state's election laws. Disney got involved in Florida's law a couple years back that law basically restricted discussions of gender and sexual identity in elementary schools. Disney got involved and was really active in lobbying against that legislation. And this one's not even really related to any state policy specifically, but even, Bud Light brought on the Dylan Mulvaney influencer, a transgender influencer, and a lot of people got mad about that because, they felt like there was some kind of social issue just kind of being pushed there. And then generally speaking, I think you just have this recognition, especially on the parts of state treasurers and others, that a lot of companies are just refusing to invest in certain types of companies. Like oil and gas businesses are a good example because, these companies say they're bad for the environment, but, whether they're bad for the environment or good for the environment, either way, they're really important for the economies of these states like West Virginia and Texas and some of the other states that are pushing back against this. And so, you're having elected officials now kind of ask themselves these questions of, okay, these investment companies are refusing to do business with or refusing to invest in these companies that are super important to our state's economy. Do we want to support those? Do we want to support those companies who are, in a sense, like boycotting us and some of our most essential goods and services?
Which is a great little roundup from the last couple of years. We appreciate that. I think, listeners always appreciate those touch points. To be clear, over the last few years, there has been more of an effort to restrict ESG investing, right?
Yeah, there's definitely been more of a push to oppose ESG investing. Consumers Research has a pretty comprehensive legislation tracker. It goes back to 2020. We've used it a lot to kind of help inform our research and all that. And that tracker shows almost 500 bills introduced since 2020 opposing ESG. 66 had been enacted. And then just generally speaking, and then on the other side, you've had 300 supporting ESG that have been introduced and only 27 have been enacted. So, give or take about half as much activity supporting, you could say. But then generally speaking, too, you've just seen a lot more state executives just kind of becoming aware of some of the issues that we talked about before related to oil and gas industries and stuff like that, and not quite the same level of organized effort to support it or support the companies that are boycotting industries.
I got you. So policy advocacy groups helped us identify 6 major types of reform proposals opposing ESG investing and then 5 supporting ESG investing. So there are 6 that we've identified that are reform proposals, again, that are opposing ESG investing, and then 5 supporting ESG investing. And we don't have an hour and a half to go over all of those right now. So if listeners would like to take a deeper dive into either of those buckets, they can find a few helpful links in our show notes. But of these 2 batches, Jimmy, have any reform proposals been more common than others? Let's start with those that oppose ESG investing.
Yeah. So on the opposing side, probably the biggest one this year, which this was a pretty big change from the last year, which we can kind of talk about more lately. But you've seen bills prohibiting certain types of social credit scoring and discrimination against people and businesses based on ESG factors. You might have heard of the term like debanking. debanking gets thrown around a lot. We don't use it all that much, but it's basically this idea that if you really steer into ESG scoring and social credit scores, you could have situations where banks basically refuse to do business with people and businesses, refuse to give them loans, and they would base these decisions on factors that are not just related to your ability to repay the loan, right? These are factors like you posted something bad on Facebook, or your business does this thing that we think is bad, or anything like that. And so this type of bill, this what we're calling anti-discrimination bill, it basically says you can't deny people loans or mortgages or whatever they need just because they kind of support causes that you disagree with. And so this particular reform has really taken off this year, and we've seen 100 bills, give or take, get introduced so far, and about 10 have been enacted so far just this year alone. The other really big one, this one has been kind of one of the OGs, is what we call the sole fiduciary approach opposing. Fiduciary is a pretty big word. Yeah. And so there's like a wide range of strictness in this category, but basically a fiduciary is someone who has a legal duty to act in the best interests of the person they're working for. So, a lot of times a real estate agent has a fiduciary duty to whoever they're representing, and the real estate agent can't say things to the other real estate agent or the other person in the transaction that might hinder your ability to negotiate. They have to disclose facts about the house if they know about, potential problems. They basically have to act with your best interest in mind and without conflicts of interest. And so this sole fiduciary category of legislation, it kind of takes that similar idea and applies it to public pensions especially. And the idea is they kind of require whoever's managing those funds to act in the best interest of the beneficiaries. So that might be like the pensioners in the case of a lot of state pensions. And it basically says you have to act purely in their best financial interest. You can't have other political interests that motivate your investing. You can't have environmental interests that might conflict with the best financial practices, all that kinds of stuff. And so this has been, like I said, another big one. Another about 100 bills have been introduced for this one. And of those, about my most recent check, 6 had been enacted so far this year. And if you have any questions, feel free to interject, because I feel like I'm just rambling. But
no, sure, yeah. I feel like each of them deserves their own summary. So I know you have one more. So those two obviously taking up a ton of space there, about 100 bills each. That's a lot of activity. I know that you mentioned another one in this group before we got on the call. I believe they're called anti-boycott approaches. What are they, and how do they work?
Yeah.
What have we seen?
So the other really big category, like you said, is anti-boycott approaches. And that type of bill basically says something like, if you refuse to invest in or do business with certain types of businesses just because you don't like what they're doing or you don't like their product for like some kind of non-financial reason, like we kind of talked about, a lot of times fossil fuel companies fall into this category of companies that people don't want to invest in, or weapons producers are another big one that you see a lot of boycotts of. So this bill basically says if you boycott industries like that or specific businesses that you don't like, then basically you're not eligible to do business with the state. You can't have a contract with the state. And that applies to a lot of the asset management companies. The big name that gets thrown around in a lot of ESG discussions is BlackRock, because it's just one of the biggest companies in the world, and it manages trillions of dollars. And they've been a pretty active institutional supporter of ESG.
Right.
And so some states are saying companies like that don't like oil drilling and refuse to invest in fossil fuel companies can't manage state money. And we've seen about 60 bills introduced on that note this year, and 2 of them have been enacted this year. And then there are a few other kind of categories that are just much smaller, related to consumer protection and opposing some federal ESG mandates and some other things like that, but much fewer bills in those categories.
Yeah, and if our listeners are really curious, I know some of them definitely are. We got all those links for you right in the show notes, so you can feel free to get into the weeds there. And I thought it was interesting, just off the jump, looking at our notes here. The least active of those 3 categories that you mentioned still has, with 60 bills, more than the most active category of the types of reform efforts that support ESG investing. So that's a little bit about those. I know it's a much shorter list with less activity, but what's going on that front?
Yeah. So on the other side, you kind of have, like you said, a lot less activity, but the most common ones that you see are, they almost reverse everything that's opposing ESG and flip it on its head. So the industry divestment approach, we have been talking about boycotts and divestments. That was the last one we talked about on the opposed side.
Gotcha.
But the industry divestment approach kind of takes the opposite position and says that, okay, if you want to do business with the state, then, you have to divest from companies that hurt the environment or, have bad social policies in the eyes of the state. And so far, we've seen 47 bills like that introduced, and one of those get enacted this year. The non-financial consideration approach, that's another big one. And it's you could think of it sort of like the reverse of the sole fiduciary approach. We're getting super nerdy here. But the non-financial consideration approach basically says that if you're a fiduciary for the state, then the state or its pensioners or its employees or whoever, then if you're acting in their best interest, then you need to be considering, for example, environmental factors, social factors, and things that might fall outside of we'll say, the standard range of financial considerations in order to do your job well. And so we've seen 16 bills on that front, and 1 has been enacted this year. And then really the other major type of bill in the support category is this approach that basically requires states to consider ESG, diversity, equity, those types of factors when they award contracts to companies. So, when we're talking about contracts, they might require that the state contract with a certain number of minority-owned businesses or women-owned businesses, or they might have some kind of quotas in place, or they might require that any businesses that do business with the state have some kind of diversity, equity, inclusion plan. Basically, some kind of non-financial consideration as a requirement for state contracts. And on that front, we've seen 37 bills introduced this year, but none of them have been enacted.
Okay. So still like a little bit of activity in these buckets, but not a lot of bills getting enacted. And then that brings us to our next question. 6 months somehow already down in 2024, with state legislative sessions coming to a close all around the country. Ballotpedia has identified roughly 20 enacted bills related to ESG, again, whether they support or oppose it. Roughly 20 there, if I have that right. And only 2 of those, as you just mentioned, Jimmy, Oregon House Bill 4083 and Maryland House Bill 1212, were aiming to promote ESG investing in any given state. So 2-parter for you here, Jimmy. What did those bills purport to do? And are there any indications as to why we've seen so few bills promoting ESG in general? And are they being proposed, as you mentioned, and just failing maybe? I guess that's a 3-part question, but what do you think?
Yeah, so I know the Oregon bill proposed requiring the Oregon Investment Council and the state treasurer. The state treasurer basically has a responsibility to act as the chief investment officer for the state and of the Public Employees Retirement Fund, basically just requiring divestment from thermal coal companies. So that's like one of those really sort of typical bills, we might say, supporting ESG. Really classic example, coal and fossil fuels are bad in the view of the bill, so the state shouldn't invest in it.
Wow.
The Maryland bill, that one required the Maryland State Retirement Agency to consider ESG factors in its investments. And so, that bill is basically like, okay, there are certain risks that climate change and other kind of non-financial factors, social considerations might pose to a business model. And so if the retirement agency is going to work properly in its position as a fiduciary, then it needs to consider those things in its investments according to the bill. The second part of your question is definitely up for debate and interpretation. I definitely wouldn't regard what I say here as scripture or anything like that. But it's definitely hard to pinpoint exactly why the gap between the support and opposition is so big. One reason might just be that there are more Republican trifectas than Democratic trifectas.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
that's a good point.
Just from a purely structural standpoint, I think there are 23 Republican and 17 Democratic trifectas right now.
Got it. And that obviously enables them to just get, your party controls all three major branches of government within the state. It just makes it easier to advance whatever you're trying to get after, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So that could be a piece of it. 23 to 17 isn't a huge difference, so it probably doesn't explain all of it. So I think another piece is I think a lot of support for ESG really happens at the executive and administrative level. But that stuff is a little harder for us to kind of see and to track. So like pension boards have generally a lot of flexibility in managing the pension plans however they want to, and then pension boards themselves outsource a lot of the day-to-day management to asset management companies like Vanguard, BlackRock, which we mentioned before, State Street. Those are kind of the big three in passive asset management. And so when other companies are making a lot of the day-to-day decisions, it's also hard to track how it's being invested and what philosophies are kind of driving it. But you can do a lot of ESG support just by changing who you're going to contract with to manage your funds and making decisions at the pension board level. And then on a similar note, it's also just worth considering that a lot of companies are considering ESG factors in their corporate decisions. We just mentioned companies like Disney beforehand. And so a lot of companies kind of already factor that into their calculus. And then hundreds of asset management companies are out, including the biggest in the world, like the BlackRocks and the Vanguards. And, they're already considering ESG in their investment strategies too. And they've signed on to sustainable investing initiatives like the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative and Climate Action 100. And, we've kind of started to see a slow move away from some of those initiatives lately in the face of some investigations in the US and states kind of going after those initiatives in some cases. But even in a lot of Republican states, a lot of them still contract with asset managers that openly consider some of these non-financial factors in their decision making. So all that to basically say is, in a lot of these cases, the status quo is ESG investing. So if you support ESG, you might be more likely to kind of submit to the status quo, if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. And I feel like I might already mention this in this interview, Jimmy, but we do not pay you enough to have given us such a thorough dive that you already have, but I'm going to ask you to do a little bit more for us. Again, you've just done a great job running through all the bills we've seen enacted this year opposing ESG. But are you noticing any trends among the sorts of bills that are getting enacted? I know that we talked about this a little bit briefly already, but are they targeting any specific areas of ESG investing or anything like that? Again, those types of bills that are opposing it. We've seen so many of them, as you mentioned. Again, it's disparate, the comparison between the two. But what trends are emerging for you if you had to put your thumb on it for listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most significant trend in my view has been this move towards emphasizing the anti-discrimination and anti-credit scoring bills. They're kind of on the more consumer protection-y side of the equation and less on the pension. So like I mentioned before, we've seen something like 10 anti-discrimination bills enacted this year compared to, I think it was like 7 last year and then 1 the year before. So, these numbers have really kind of spiked up in the last couple of years. And you see that in the bills introduced as well. 100 bills this year on this topic compared to like 60 the year before and 20 in 2022. So it's going up like 40 a year. And then at the same time, you're kind of seeing this move away from quite as much activity on some of the laws governing public funds and contracts. Hey, those bills are definitely still out there. We talked about those above as well, like 100 sole fiduciary bills and 60 anti-boycott bills this year. So those are still getting tons of attention too. But I mentioned before, I think we've seen about a total of 8 bills between the anti-boycott and sole fiduciary bills actually get enacted. And that's compared to I think it was almost 30 bills that were enacted last year between those two categories. So that's a pretty big drop off.
Yeah, definitely a big drop off. As we start to wrap up here, Jimmy, and as we've been talking about through our whole conversation here today, many state legislative sessions have ended or will end soon. Again, this episode is being recorded on Monday, May 20th. It's going to release later this week on the 24th, which I believe is Thursday. If I have the days wrong, I apologize. So we might not see a whole lot more shaking here in the short term, long story short. But the presidential election is casting a shadow over everything in our politics this year. And while I don't think, ESG is central to any of our major candidates' agendas, I'm wondering how the presidential race might be factoring into what we could see in the future when it comes to ESG related policy. What do you think, Jimmy?
Yeah, it definitely doesn't seem to be central campaign messaging. If you've made it this far in the podcast, you might realize that this is a super nerdy topic that just causes a lot of people to glaze over. But the election will definitely have a pretty big effect on some of these ESG policies at the federal level. Over the last few years, the Biden administration has enacted several rules related to ESG, including a rule that explicitly reversed some of the Trump era ESG related rules. So, if you were to get a shift in the White House again, you would probably see kind of some of those Biden rules reversed, if you want to use that word. But a lot of kind of the significance here comes back to a federal law called the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974. Everyone just calls it ERISA. And that governs most private retirement plans throughout the whole country. And it sets standards for the duties and obligations of the people who manage those plans for other people. It basically says, again, that the people who manage these plans have to act in the best interest of the investors. And then it kind of just defines what it looks like to act in their best interest. So the Trump administration, for example, issued 2 significant rules in 2020, and those basically prohibited any sorts of ESG considerations in investments or corporate shareholder votes on behalf of someone else. So you can't take someone else's money, invest it based on your political beliefs, and then, make corporate shareholder votes the same way. It says you gotta stick to the financials. But then, the Biden administration in 2023 kind of replaced those rules with a new one that, again, to kind of keep a long story short here, allows fiduciaries to consider ESG criteria in their investment related decisions. And it basically says that a lot of times ESG considerations are relevant to the investment performance of a stock or portfolio. So you kind of have two different approaches there when it comes to these ERISA governed pension plans. And then the Biden administration also pretty recently this year finalized rules which are currently being reviewed in the courts, and that would require corporations to report their greenhouse gas emissions to the Securities and Exchange Commission and basically just do a bunch of extra reporting on climate risks to their business model. And the argument there is that you need more disclosures so that investors can make informed decisions, just based on the sort of risks that face your business. But then, there are other people on the other side who think rules like that just exceed the agency's authority. They think the rules just are too big of an imposition on business and they're hard metrics to track and stuff like that. And so they don't think that's a good rule, and it could be one that would be up for review if power shifts.
Yeah, it feels like one of those things, right, where so many of these different big bucket categories are just flip-flopping back and forth when somebody new else, right? So we'll have to wait and see later this year. But Jimmy, you've been great. We're probably going to be talking about ESG again here for long, so hope to have you back on the show soon. But thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, and for our listeners, you can learn more about our ESG coverage and some of the bills we've been seeing this year at the links in our show notes. We'll be back next week with another episode. Make sure to subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Frank Festa, and thank you for listening. We'll see you next week.